Hello everyone, and today we're going to talk about Dockerfiles and how to use them. So if you're interested, stick around. And if you don't yet know what containers are, I recommend watching my last video since this video builds up on that. So to start off, what is a Dockerfile? I always like to think about anything related to Docker in terms of a house, because all of the different terms start making a little bit more sense to me then. So that's what I'm going to use to explain what Dockerfiles are. The Docker container is the house, and the Dockerfile is a set of instructions and requirements that you would need in order to build that house or, run that container. Typically, every Dockerfile will start off with a from statement that will define the starter kit that you would need in order to build the image to run your Docker container. I like to think about it like the foundation for your house. You can't get started on constructing your house if there is no bedrock for you to place the house on so that it doesn't just sink into the earth. That starter kit will usually have like OS level requirements and install any basic packages that you would need in order to get up and running. You can get as customized as your project needs you to be. That brings me to the second question that we're going to talk about, which is how can we use Dockerfiles? If Dockerfiles are a blueprint, then the thing that we need them for is the actual construction of the house. And that construction site is our Docker image. You use a Dockerfile by first writing it out or getting one from an online source. If I were to recommend some, I would definitely say, look at Medium articles, look at dockerfile.github.io, which is not owned by Docker, or look at Docker Hub. There's a lot of different resources for you to use. Once you have your Dockerfile, you can then build your image by just running the command docker build and then -t, which is basically tagging the image that is going to be built when this command runs, the name of the tag, and then dot. So to break down this command, basically we're using the Docker CLI. We're telling it we want to build an image. We don't want to run a container. We don't want to shell into a container. We don't want to get the stats. We want to build. So Docker build. A side note, in terms of terminology, you are building an image in order to run a container. Docker build, right? The -t is giving the image a tag that will be useful for later on. A typical convention that I've seen is like, giving it the name of the project and then colon like latest or colon v1.00, something like that. Stick to a naming convention as it'll make your versioning for images a lot easier to keep track of. Typically, if you don't, Docker will automatically tag it as latest, and it'll then start like untagging things as you build the image over and over again, which can make it hard to keep track of like, hey, this is the image that I want. And then the dot in the command means please use the Dockerfile within, this folder that I'm running it in. Like you're running this in your terminal is supposedly opened up to your project folder, and it's saying the Dockerfile is in this project folder. If it's not, then you can use -f and then give it, the path to the folder that the Dockerfile is in. That's basically how you use a Dockerfile. And the purpose is for the Dockerfile to then build that image, which you can reuse across many different containers. So that answers our two questions, but I wanted to leave you with some tips since I've actually written a lot of different Dockerfiles and have learned a lot of things not to do. So the first tip is to make sure you need to actually write a Dockerfile from scratch. If you can find an existing Dockerfile to use as a source of reference or just to copy to kick off your project, then I would absolutely do that, because writing a really good Dockerfile in order to efficiently build an image can actually be tricky, especially if you're working on more complex projects like machine learning projects. Number 2 is I would Dockerize your project from the beginning. So I would have some kind of Dockerfile the minute you initiate your project, because that Dockerfile will probably only be 4 lines, 5 lines. It'll be super smooth sailing and you won't run into a horde of bugs, which has come almost every time I've tried to initiate Docker halfway through a project. The third is to understand Docker layering within your Dockerfiles. That basically means how to combine different commands in order to concatenate things that originally would have been 2 different layers into one. This is a more complex topic that I'm definitely going to be talking about in another video because I actually love this topic. I've seen Docker build times go from 10 minutes to 30 seconds just because of how I've rearranged or combined the different layers in my existing Dockerfile. And the 4th tip, which is my last one, is to absolutely refer to Docker's documentation. I know that sounds basic. Like, why would I just tell you to go to docker.com? But the number of times that I have seen a bug that easily could be solved by just referring to the documentation is like uncountable. Their documentation is really good, and you can understand the difference between, do I need to use the expose command in my Dockerfile versus what's the difference between entry point versus CMD? Which one do I need? They tend to make it pretty clear, and I think you just can't beat the documentation. Like, if there was a better place, I would tell you to go there. That's pretty much it for Dockerfiles and how to use them. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments below. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to this channel, and I hope that you have a great day. Okay, thank you.